Welcome back to Brains, Minds, and Consciousness. Today we are going to finally get into mind. We've covered brains in great depth, and we are finally a big chunk of the way up the mountain, the conceptual, ethereal, mental mountain. So, we are trying to go from the hardware we've been discussing, the wires of the brain, which we now know quite a bit about. Neurons can send action potentials, and they activate each other, and they interact in complex ways, and they can capture all kinds of fun stuff like shapes and edges and colors and yay. And they're all firing all the time, and there's all kinds of stuff happening. How the heck does that become a mind? So, brains to minds. We focused on all this observable stuff about brains, the structures, the cells, the neural populations, the sensors that we have that can detect the outside world. But at some point, it becomes pretty difficult to characterize all of these functioning units together because there's millions of them and billions of them, and they are all interconnected in complicated ways. Even if we can measure each individual one of them with with powerful technology, it's still really complex. So at some point, we have to sort of push off from the baseline, like imagine you're in a pool and you're hanging off the edge of the pool. Push off into the water and let certain things become questions of the conceptual as opposed to the hardware. And so we're trying to get up a level in the analysis of, okay, given that these things are all doing very interesting stuff, what are the properties of the whole dang thing? What are the properties of a mind? So, minds are, you're aware of them, right? You are a person. You have a mind. You recognize that others have minds, even though you can't directly observe them. You can't crack somebody's head open and observe their mind. You can only observe their brain, right? Even if you had cool tools, you really still can't observe the mind. So, the best way to think about a mind is a collection of cognitive capabilities, things that you're able to do, capacities that you have, and how those tools, those systems, connect to each other, right? You have perception. You can perceive the outside world. You have memory. You can hold on to information over time. You have language. You can communicate complex ideas and thoughts using your mouth, right? Using your fingers and computer. Or pencil, right? Scratch on the paper. You can decide things. You can come to a fork in the woods and you say, I think I'll go left. And you have reasons for doing that. You have you measured something internally to make the decision, right? These are all things that you have available to you in your mental toolkit that interact with each other. You also aren't always aware of all these things either. You don't always think about the reasons for every decision you make, but you're still making them, right? So these are functions of a mind, and we can talk about them as distinct from whatever medium we're using. Let's dig into that. So one nice kind of clean, although oversimplified conceptualization of the mind in cognitive science is the mind is the software that is running on the brain's hardware. Right? So the mind is the experience, the tool, the things that you can do. You can pop up in your message app and send a message out to the world. You're not concerned with how all the hardware manages this. You're concerned with what the functions are. Does it do it? Does it look up that recipe I need? Does it, call the right person when I tell it to, right? So while the mechanics, the mechanisms inside are all these electronic chips all firing information at each other, really what you're concerned with is the functional mind of the system, the operating system. So that's a nice way to at least dip our toes in, but there's competing theories. Given that it's tough to pin down what a mind precisely is, like how do I measure it, where does it exist in what, etc. Different fields might take a different approach to their own understanding of it. Psychologists might have one understanding of what the functions of mind are, whereas a biologist would have a very different set of things that it would ascribe to a mind, right? So there's even variation among them. The main takeaway is that the concept of a mind can vary, but there's a consistent theme that it focuses on the capabilities of the system rather than its small microscopic subcomponents. So let's walk into systems. The best way to understand a mind is to understand systems, systematic thinking, systemic thinking. Systems are all over science, they're all over the world, but they're everywhere. Biological systems, social systems, astrophysical systems, cognitive systems. So what is a system? Systems are made up of several distinct components. Think of like your cells, right? Your cells have mitochondria, they have a nucleus, they have a cell wall, all these different distinct components that serve different functions. And systems have both bonding relations and boundaries. What are bonding relations? So, bonding relations mean that different components of the system can interact with one another. So components A and B are said to have a bonding relation if A's state is altered by changes to B's state or vice versa. So these two elements are considered, in contact. They influence one another. Boundaries, though, systems will also define what is and isn't a part of the system. So what is within the system and what is outside of it, right? Free-floating particles, viruses, for example, are not part of the cellular system that a single cell has, right? But it can, attempt to interact. So, to understand systems, the relations and the boundaries of the system are key, right? If I have a fairly clear understanding of, say, the way two parts interact and the influences upon them, then I can understand things fairly well. If I only have a partial understanding of the way a system is influenced by some kind of stimulus or whatever, so I see a change in A connected to some event I, but I don't know that B exists and is thus in contact and part of the system with A, I'm going to have a pretty confused stance on how the A-B system works because I don't understand B at all. So here's an example from the depths of history. The tides. Why do the tides change? The sea changes on both a daily and a yearly basis. Back in the long ago, the way we explained this was Poseidon is doing it. They didn't have a good connective theory. All they could see was that the ocean was moving up and down in ways that they couldn't quite predict, in patterns that seemed sort of capricious, right? This is the will of a fickle god deciding things for us here on Earth, right? But that's only because we could only observe part of the system. The behavior of the tide was nonsensical until we had a better understanding of both the solar system and gravity. Because it turns out, when you have these other bodies in the picture, the way the sun interacts with our planet, but also the way the moon's gravity interacts with our planet, suddenly you have a complete system. It's no longer spooky and strange to us how the tides work. We have a full picture of what is causing the beach to come and go within the water, right? So this is an example from history, which we're going to do this a lot, getting into mind. This is an example of how adding better understanding and figuring out which things can influence one another in a larger system helps us understand the phenomenon. We can make predictions about how the tide works now because we know how all the moving parts exist. So how do we apply this to systems of a mind? Which relationships are important, right? Which boundaries are important? Are there consequences to drawing these lines between what we think of as a mind and what we think of as not a mind, right? So, let's think about large and small systems. Larger, more inclusive systems are inherently more complex. They have to have more moving parts, and they're difficult to ask questions about. This is why we abstracted up from the brain in the first place, right? If we just said, well, the mind is the full collection of all interacting neurons of the brain, oh dear, that's like saying that the solar system is the collection of all the atoms that are present. You know, you're foregoing larger interactive pieces, and you're just kind of leaving it at, well, everything in this junk box is the thing, so good luck, you know. So, but the trouble is that smaller, more exclusive systems are easier to ask specific questions about, but they might start omitting important relationships, right? So to understand complex behavior, you have to have a certain amount of encompassing these different connective relationships. So one of the first directions we can take is kind of looking at the system that the mind lives in with the body, right? So there's lots of ways people think the mind and the body interact, right? Typically in the realm of philosophy, but this can affect how we define the systems that we talk about going forward. So it's important to, incorporate all these questions. In fact, you'll find that cognitive science is one of the sciences that fits closest to philosophy because of all these sort of self-reflexive questions we have to ask that are very hard to pin down. So what follows is a primer on some of the different ideas that we can that come together to say, hey, how do mind and body interact in a system? One such philosophy is mind-body dualism. So this is the idea, it's been applied in cognitive science and throughout history of there's a hard line between the systems of the mind and the body. They are decomposable, meaning we can approach each one as completely separate from the other. They might interact, but the systems are different. So you have a mind and you have a body. They are different things and they interact, right? So this is useful for simplifying the concept of a mind. We don't have to worry about the brain. The mind sort of lives on its own terms, does its own kind of stuff, right? But it leaves us with this problem of it's what's known as the symbol grounding or binding problem. How does the real world cross the boundary into the mind, right? We have the real world. We've actually talked about how all the sensors can pick things up from the real world, like light and vibrations and all this great stuff, so that we have a perception of the real world. But then how might that then elevate off of our neurons into what we are calling mind, right? It gets a bit trippy, So this is also sort of the classic take, We talk about the mind of ourselves and other people as this sort of ethereal thing where we don't really think of it as the knocking around of neurons inside of our skulls making up the mind, right? So, but it leaves us with this problem of how the heck does something go to the mind space? And as it turns out, there's a lot of different attempts to sort of connect these two, find out the ways that, perhaps not find out, more conceptualize the ways that mind and body interact, or maybe are connected or are subsets of one another, that kind of thing. So in monist theories, something to keep in mind, monist theories, there's only one kind of stuff. There is either it's all the physical stuff in the world, or it's all the mental stuff. Either way, it's just the one kind of stuff. Whereas dualist theories posit that there's two kinds of stuff. There's mental stuff and physical stuff, right? But how they interact is different in these different philosophies. So let's walk through some historical philosophies of how minds and bodies do. So monist theories, these are easy. The simplest monist theory is everything is just physical stuff. Materialism. Materialism is the idea that perhaps there is such a thing as a mind, but it just is a physical property of the world. It is a physical property of your neurons. It just is. It's connected to the world, right? Whereas there's a different take that this is sort of the brain in a jar take, mentalism, that perhaps there is no physical world at all. Perhaps all we have is the mental experience. Now, these actually are somewhat compelling. They're not as kind of curious as these dualist theories are. Monist theories are straightforward. It's a little bit less straightforward to think about the mentalism side of things, but the idea is that either way, everything is unified, right? Dualist theories have some different takes on, okay, so there might be mind stuff, there might be physical stuff. How do they connect? One nice clean one is interactionism. They happily interact with each other. They influence each other. The mind can cause things to happen in the body's experiences can cause things to happen in the mind, and they both exist, but they happily inhabit sort of a system together, right? Pre-established harmony is the concept that, hey, there's both minds and physical world, but everything is already predetermined anyway, and they're just going to line up because they have the dominoes are falling in that direction. By the way, you don't have to fully grasp all of these for us to sort of deal with them today. This is just to highlight that there are lots of ways to ask these questions that these questions are hard to verify, right? Perhaps there is mental stuff. Perhaps there is, just because it's not directly observable, what is the causal relationships between them? How about occasionalism, where these things connect to each other not at all, and it just so happens that some outside force happens to be causing changes in both minds and bodies at the same rate. Some hyper force. The idea being that the causal relationships between these two things are irrelevant. The world is just happening either way. Not a great basis for, say, scientific exploration of causality, but it is still a conceived thought about how mind and matter interact. Epiphenomenalism is the idea that you do have a mind, but it's kind of just along for the ride. The whatever the mind stuff is, whatever the complex thing that is the mental experience, it's just arising from things that are happening in the physical version of things out there in the world. And finally, just another one is the double aspectism, parallelism, the idea that just so happens that the mind is in its own space doing things identically to the way that things are happening in the physical world. I know, again, this is not all grokkable right away. It's not all going to just fall into step with your understanding of things, because these are grasping at the very edges of how we can conceptualize something that we can barely see the edges of, right? The mind is a complicated and fairly mysterious thing, at least to begin with, in our studies of it. In the before times, before cognitive science was better established, these were the only ways we had to sort of tackle these questions. But that doesn't mean they're without merit, right? So these are what you can call ontologies. They are theories of what is knowable and what is not, right? In some of these cases, we would say, oh, well, we can know all kinds of things about the material world version of things, but it's impossible to know things about the mental space, and so on. So not all of these are super plausible to most of us, right? But they've been adopted by many to varying degrees and effects. And you might be able to see how adopting one of these theories would affect how you define what a cognitive system is, right? If it's a magical force that lives outside of causality, it might not be something worth studying. It might just be left, oh, that's the mysterious mind stuff, right? But if it's something that interacts directly, or perhaps isn't something at all and is just the complexity of the physical properties, that might lead you to a different way of shaping your understanding of the mind. So, we can rewind a little bit through history and see how some of the more famous thinkers took on these kinds of questions. Early thoughts can help us sort out some of the most prominent arguments through time and see how they evolve towards stronger understandings of what mind is. So, let's go on a historical journey. Pythagoras, he didn't just do triangles. He believed everything could be explained through numbers. His famous geometrical theorem, or how musical tuning works, right? So the sounds that come out of vibrating strings have mathematical properties, right? Numbers and math form the basis of his ontology. Numbers are the only knowable reality. They're the only thing we can measure. They're the only thing that we can observe and turn into conceptual values, right? The physical world is just a derivative copy. So the mental world of these numbers is more important than the physical world. Understand the numerical properties of the world and what's hiding behind it, and thus you understand everything, right? In Pythagoras' view, the mind is probably some kind of numerical engine, right? And there are things that aren't quite wrong about that. If you think about what we've talked about, the ability to take information from the outside world and convert it to a firing rate, that's a numerical thing. But he's also positing that the only real things in the world are this sort of floating, ethereal, numerical stuff. Give and take. He's got a point, but he's also a little bit off. And that's kind of the point of these thinkers through history, is they only had so much access to tools and ways to observe new things. They were working with less information. So, they might have been wrong in many ways, but they were at least, aiming in the right direction. So, that's Pythagoras. Heraclitus. His approach is everything in nature is in a constant state of flux and change. So, given what I know about things that are constantly in flux and change, I think everything is made of fire. Okay. So, because everything is changing, nothing can be known, not for real at least. And so your senses can't be trusted. Everything is fire and change and chaos, and our senses aren't perfect, so therefore the mind is probably a useless bag. What do you really do with that approach? He's not wrong. Things are in constant states of change and flux, right? Things aren't made of fire, but energy is certainly down in there somewhere. And so he has this skeptical take on things can't really be known because nothing is fixed, nothing is set. Fair enough. But that doesn't lead us to a very good space to tackle understanding the properties of a mind, right? Now, a different take. Plato's Parmenides. This is sort of the opposite to Heraclitus, and saying that all change is an illusion. Reality is fixed, motionless, and finite, and it can only be understood through reason and logic, right? You may have heard of this paradox, Zeno's paradox. All motion is an illusion. As you move towards something, you are only ever cutting the distance between you and it in half. So, as I close in on an object, I've cut the distance in half. As I close in again, I've cut the distance in half. It's taking me less time, but ultimately, I will never get there. Everything is... The idea that something has changed is foolish because I can never be fully in direct contact with the object. Again, there is something there, right? Your distance between things, the particles of your shoe versus the particles of the wall, what is being, quote, in contact? there is space between them if you really cut it down really finely. The idea here is that there are properties of the world. There are fixed properties of the world. Even if there might be chaos around it, there are fixed properties of the world, and we can reason about them. We can use logic. So in this view, in Plato's Parmenides, the mind is a perfect logical reasoner. It extracts the logical reason from the world and uses it. Again, something there. The goal is not to take these and say, what a bunch of jerks. The goal is to say, what were they orbiting? What kind of actual sort of central truth are they getting around? Plato also had the theory of forms. So he was a student of Socrates, influenced by Pythagoras, or Pythagoreans, and he brought in this idea, kind of elaborating on the Pythagorean stuff, of the theory of forms. So everything in the real world is just a distorted copy of something that is pure, a pure form, an abstract idea of a thing. So every apple is just a derivative of a real Platonic ideal of an apple. In the world of forms, in the world of concepts, we all have access to that world. Ooh, that's pretty good. So that's actually interesting. We're bringing the concept of concepts to bear in understanding how brains might solve things. Because when you think about this, I look at an apple and I know it's an apple, even if it has different colors and shapes and the stem is in a different spot and it has those little butt crack shapes on it and stuff, right? It's still an apple, right? The ideal form is something I kind of have access to. So I don't think any of us are yet convinced by the Plato's theories of forms, but at least we are seeing where it's starting to touch the edges of useful mental concepts. So, knowledge of the forms. We get into, Plato thinks, true knowledge can only be had through these forms. The soul, or the mind, originates from the world of ideal forms, right? So these things exist, and we are from there. This is a kind of a dualism. The mind it lives in the world of perfect forms, and the ideal forms are just contaminated by the senses. So our mind's job is to remember the lost knowledge by ignoring elements of the senses and focusing on the ideal forms. And again, think about that. There are imperfections in every apple you look at. They're all quite different, but we know they're an apple. So what are we doing? His take is we are chipping away the imperfections that our senses see, our foolish senses, and the mind says, let me tell you what that actually is. The secret perfect knowledge that I have because I am from the plane of perfect objects. So we can actually lay this out on a grid to help us understand some of this. In this quadrant space, this Cartesian space, we have the physical world in the green and the mental world above it in the blue. And then we have objects and states of mind. Okay, so this is sort of the concept that Plato puts forth with this ideal forms idea, to say, look, here's what is in the world, and here is the only things that we can actually know are up there in the mental space. Everything else is sort of these falsehoods, these corruptions of the real world. So in the empirical world, you have things like that's the physical world of objects, right? Visible things are in the empirical world, right? And so are images, things that you can't really argue with, right? You look at an apple, you see an apple, right? But the knowable world, the things that we can actually know in the mental space, aren't related to those things. They are instead things like the mathematical objects. So this is the Pythagorean influence, of course, of how the mathematical relationships of things in the world. We can understand those things. the ideas in pure forms, right? So the highest, purest concept of an apple or a table or a dog, right? And then, the good, the highest knowledge. This is the idea of sort of in the moral spectrum, the things that we know to be good, right? There's issues with thinking that you've pinned down all things that are good and not, but this is the idea. So this, on the left side here, this is the conceptualization of objects. The empirical world has these things that it can give to the mind, but the mind's job is to turn them into the real things, the real stuff, the real concepts, the mathematical objects, the ideas, and the good, right? Now, on the other side, we have states of mind. So these are the kinds of things, the sort of the processes, the facets of the mind that aren't the objects that we act on, but the mind itself. The episteme up here in the top is the mental stuff of mind, genuine knowledge, right? So we have the concepts from the knowable world on the left there, and then we have the ways that we interact with that. So things like gnosis, intuition and intelligence, the way we think about these things, or rather the way that we process these things. We also have dianoia, so thought and reasoning, the ways that we the ways that we approach these objects and create new thoughts, create new ideas here. We also have, though, the fallible. Remember, he loves the fallibility of the physical world. So we have the fallible parts of the mind, the doxa, the things that are only what seems to be. So, for example, pistis, which is belief and common sense. Beliefs are, you can have as many as you want. They aren't always accurate. That's why they are not Platonic ideal forms, right? They are not perfectly rational. We also have acacia, so imagining, things that we can pretend, right? This is the way of explaining away the fact that you can have things that aren't Platonic ideals. You can have things that are fallible in your mind, right? So this is actually pretty good. I don't agree with almost any of it at this point, but think about the space that they're reasoning from when they're chopping these ideas up. They're getting things from the physical world into more abstract concepts in the mental world. And they're talking about the fallibility of some certain kinds of mental processes, right? We can't always get everything right. We're capable of imagining counterfactual worlds. This isn't the worst. It ain't good, though. So Plato focused on these ideal forms. It was a very, very, focused approach. I wouldn't say that we agree with all of these points, right? But we can see the beginning of understanding minds as abstract concepts. The ideal apple as a general concept of an apple that, as we discussed before, that's something our brain is pretty good at. Abstracting something up into a form that doesn't really care about the particulars, only really pattern matches on the general idea of a thing, right? Now, in comes Aristotle. Aristotle was a student of Plato's, but he, had his own flavor. He took his own approach. So Aristotle says, hey, Plato, the physical world is real, and it can be known through the senses. So it's this idea of empiricism. So knowledge comes from experience, right? This is the idea where knowledge can come from the world, right? Empirical research, right? Empirical findings. That is, we checked and the thing was X. Rationalism, as well, though, knowledge can be obtained by applying logic and reason to those experiences. So it's both of these together in concert, trying to bring the Platonic ideals in the sort of the high-minded rationalism stuff of the Platonic world into this idea that, hey, the real world is also there, and we do certainly learn from it. So Aristotle proposes a new take, the laws of association for understanding knowledge. What are the laws of association? We're going to spend some time with them. Laws of association, law of contiguity, law of similarity, and law of frequency. Law of contiguity. Ideas that occur together in space or time are associated with one another. So, for example, a chair often occurs with a table. We think of them as a unit at times, right? We may also think of them as predictable, right? I see a table, there's probably a chair nearby, even if it's been separated, right? It is a predictable tool. And that's just space. Time also counts. So you may have a cloud is present, and there's not always going to be lightning there, but you know that it's possible because you can connect these things. They are contiguous. The one leads to the other, right? So this is Aristotle's law of contiguity, right? So ideas can be connected by way of their position in space and time. Law of similarity and contrast. Ideas that are similar are associated, but ideas that are opposite are also associated. That's odd, but we kind of see what he's getting at here if you think about the idea of, say, correlations. Things can be positively correlated and negatively correlated. Things can have whatever it is, it can have a relationship in terms of how it is or is not similar to another object. An apple, there are features of it that are similar to an orange, right? They are both fruits, right? But they are also sort of very different, right? They have different structure overall. The orange have a very different rind than the apple has. And they have very different colors, all these things. So laws of similarity and contrast is the idea that ideas can be formed around the relationships between the properties of objects, not just their location or temporal extension. And then, finally, laws of frequency is that the idea that ideas that occur often are associated. They are more likely to be associated together. So you see something, if you only ever saw a chair and a table together once, you might not think of them as a unit. But because you always see them together, we build up an association, an idea. Where does this idea come from is sort of what we're tackling here. So those are the laws of association. And what they're giving us is a way of combining sensory experiences into complex ideas, right? We see there may be objects that are often co-located in space, but they have differences, but they have also similarities. These are all things that we can know about the object only by observing it, right? So this is giving us a way to understand how knowledge comes to be from the world. But Aristotle introduced a more detailed picture of how we reason over that knowledge as well. So not only can we empirically bring in information from the outside world, we can also do complex reasoning on it. So what were Aristotle's levels of reasoning? First comes the sensory experience, which we've already touched on deeply, light, sound, pain, all these things. The way the information gets into your body, right? Then he talks about common sense, combining the senses. A little bit different than common sense in a different light, but seeing that light and pain had a single source, right? So a very simple combination where we're saying light and pain, that must have been one single entity that caused it. I should do some more processing on it. Then we have what's known as passive reason. So generalizing sense experience to new situations. So, I could use this tool in new ways, or the kinds of things that you passively think about as you're experiencing the world. And then active reason, which is when you're trying to solve a math equation, when you're trying to create complex thoughts and ideas, learning how electricity works, whatever. This is the more active version of it. Now, these things, they sound just fine, right? Because they are what you might call just so explanations. It's just, they make sense to Aristotle, right? I'm going to cut things up into these four broad categories, and they're going to kind of make sense, I think. And again, this isn't to crap on Aristotle. This is to say, as he is more compelling than his predecessor, also recognize his limitations. So, what did Aristotle buy us here? It's yet another leap forward, right? Even more detailed picture of knowledge and cognition. We're bearing more and more resemblance to how we understand minds in the modern day, right? Obviously, we're still not quite there, but he's done something very interesting. He's saying things like, hey, there are ways that just the raw sensory experience of the world can kind of create thought, and then we have these different levels of abstraction that we can apply to thought, to those thoughts, make new thoughts, all this great stuff. That bears some resemblance to what we've talked about the brain, right? We've been able to watch as light is transformed into a very complex abstract signal that something like a face recognition system can handle, and say, that's a face, even though a face is a pretty abstract thing. So, these historical theories typically came about by trying to overcome some challenge. There was something that was not quite satisfactory about Plato's explanation that then Aristotle brings to bear and says, hey, there's more here. Let me expound on this. Let me elaborate on it. One major concern for the Greeks was this concept of action at a distance. So many Greeks proposed this fairly distinct mind-body situation, right? But as we know about systems, things that interact must have some kind of intervening component. This is a struggle, right? Because of action at a distance. We can't have interaction without some sort of component between them. That would be known as action at a distance. And it's a hole in any theory, and it's a hole in any system. And it's this concept, if I don't know what light is, how on earth can I see? It's magical from a certain angle. Let's think about this. How would you explain light or rather vision, not light. How would you explain vision, something that we all know we can do? You cover up your eyes with your hands, you can't see anymore. You let the hand go, you see again. This is true. I can tell things that are objects, right? We can all agree that that thing is a tree. How do the tree get inside of our eyes and into our minds for processing? And remember, be kind. You're starting from nothing, right? You can't have action at a distance. That's not acceptable. You can't have a way for this thing to magically get inside. So we have to figure out, how is it getting inside? And so we have some different theories. First, the idola hypothesis is the idea that trees, for example, objects in the world, are just kind of emitting little copies of themselves, little versions of themselves. And as we stumble through the world, we bump into them, right? We bump into them and we absorb them and we take them in, and that's how we know there's a tree there. So you are walking through your day and you see a cat. The only reason you can tell the cat is there is because you have bumped into one of its copies, one of its little tiny emanating copies. Everything makes copies, everything sends them everywhere. Everything's always emitting these little copies. It's not the worst take, because that's kind of how light is, actually. It hits a piece and radiates out, right? But it's not right. This is not quite right. How about the medium hypothesis? That's the idea that because we co-occupy the same medium as the tree, we are both in some sort of miasma, that medium is able to somehow connect us, right? Remember, the goal is to explain action at a distance, right? So how the heck are we getting the information from the tree? Well, something connects us up to the tree, something in the ether of existence surrounding us both connects us directly. Okay. Still not quite right. Finally, this was my favorite. the emanation hypothesis, and that is that your eyes shoot lasers that then cause the tree to send information back to you. They shoot out some kind of beam that brings information in. Huh. They got it closer than ever, but just perfectly backwards. Hey, by the properties of the laws of similarity and contrast, at least they are, connected in an idea. And the right idea, but just backwards. So, the Greek explanations. We know they're wrong, right? But, once again, they are picking something up. From the chaos of trying to understand the world around us, they have picked up the idea of copies. Somehow, a tiny version of that tree does enter us. It enters our eyes, it hits our retinas backwards and upside down, and then it goes into our brains, and we're able to work on the tree. Just like the Platonic ideals, just like the broad concepts, just like the abstraction we do when we can read text sideways, something gets inside the brain in the form of a representation. So our senses help us detect or create these little tiny copies of the world, and then we can manipulate them and change them and alter them and interact with them and think about them. This is the idea. This is the useful idea that we shuck the other stuff as we begin to understand it better. But the thing that kind of sticks around is the idea that there actually are little tiny copies of things from the world in our brains, and they are the complex representational patterns of neural activation that spawn from us detecting the object in the world. Because you wouldn't be able to think of a tree as a distinct object in your mind's eye if you couldn't do this. So, minds. Our goals are to define the systems of a mind, right? What are its components? Where do we draw the boundaries? What is included where? We've seen some differing philosophies to that effect. We've wandered through some of the early attempts at conceptualizing what a mind is, or what it's for, or what it's capable of. But we wind up with this interesting, consistent through line. The mind has some way of making representational copies of the world for use in some kind of process, some kind of cognition. And that's where we'll leave off. As always, final thought. Consider trying to understand the capabilities of something as abstract and complex as the human mind without an understanding of cellular biology, physics, or chemistry. It's a bit daunting, and it may take a lifetime to even understand where to begin. Can you think of a phenomenon today that we may similarly have no basis for understanding yet? Something complex that may have predictable laws and theorems that we have yet to pin down? What might be the first step toward them? All right, that's it. Thanks. Take care.